Narrative probability is one aspect of Walter Fisher's narrative paradigm for analyzing arguments. The narrative paradigm looks at arguments as a combination of words and/or deeds that have sequence and meaning. This combination of words and deeds is defined as a narrative or story. At its most basic, narrative probability is the internal consistency of a story. Does the narrative make sense within itself? Are there parts of it that contradict each other? In Fisher's words, does it hold together coherently? Often we are better at recognizing a story that lacks narrative probability than we are at grasping the concept abstractly. Take the following brief story as an example. Once there was an inchworm who ate so many green leafy vegetables and exercised so often he grew to be extraordinarily strong. He was so strong that he could lift a rabbit over his head. In fact, he could lift almost anything and quickly became a legend wherever he went. One day a monster stormed into the forest and began to threaten the bugs. The inchworm hurled boulders at it to drive it away, but to no avail. Finally, he concentrated on staring as hard as he could at the monster. After a few moments it began to melt away under his gaze. Soon it was reduced to a pile of gloop. This story is admittedly rather unlikely altogether, but there is one development in particular that lacks narrative probability. We are told that the inchworm has extraordinary powers of strength, and that he can carry anything. It strikes us as unfair and improbable, therefore, when he defeats the monster with what appears to be magic laser vision. His physical strength does not naturally or coherently lead to an ability to melt monsters just by looking at them, and so the story loses narrative probability and breaks down as a possible argument. Narrative probability is not confined to fictional stories, however. The same principle comes into play in advertisements and conspiracy theories, just to name a few more examples. Alan J. Bush and Victoria Davies Bush, the authors of an article on evaluating advertisements, say that examining an ad's use of narrative probability can explain why some ads are successful and others are ineffective or overly controversial. Achieving narrative probability in advertising involves incorporating elements of myth, metaphor, or convention to evoke universally agreed upon truths or accepted meanings. For instance, the elves in commercials for Keebler products contribute to narrative probability by behaving in ways that our culture generally expects elves to behave, such as cheerfully working together to bake sweets. Many insurance companies use the symbol of a rock to represent stability, a metaphor which clearly establishes narrative probability because of its nearly universal acceptance. When coherence with the common knowledge base of the audience is not created, there is a lack of narrative probability, and the credibility and ethicality of the advertisement is thrown into question. Conspiracy theorists make use of narrative probability as well by trying to propose a story that sounds more coherent than the generally accepted explanation. One relatively simple example is the moon hoax theory, which claims that Americans never really landed on the moon, and instead faked the moon landing photographs in a movie studio. Conspiracy theorists point to the absence of stars in the sky behind the moon and the rippling flag when there should be no air and therefore no breeze in space as evidence of the narrative probability of their alternative account. In part, it is our ability to gauge narrative probability that helps us to decide whether to believe this or the official narrative. As Walter Fisher said, and as this range of examples has shown, the concept of narrative probability applies to all types of communication, allowing us to evaluate the internal consistency of narratives.